Turning up the heat in Marrakesh, activists push for political reform as the UN discusses climate change in Morocco. And spotting storm clouds before they cause chaos. How a new weather satellite could save lives. I'm Martin Stanford. This is Insight. Welcome to Insight. Morocco is hosting world leaders for a major summit on climate change. But away from the conference and the security cordons, activists are calling for global attention on their push for democracy. At the end of last month, a fisherman died in an altercation with police, sparking the most serious public demonstrations since the Arab Spring of 2011. Protesters say the state is using the conference to draw attention away from problems of economic and social inequality. Insight's Sarah Firth reports.
Morocco's elections last month went ahead without a hitch. But in the weeks following, the country saw the largest protests since the 2011 Arab Spring. This was not what the new government will have wanted or indeed expected to see in their first month in power. Out on the streets in their thousands, Moroccans protested the death of a fish seller in the northern port city of Al Hoceima. They're rallying cries against the royal establishment, captured on video and shared across social media. Mohsin Fikri was a 31-year-old fish seller who died after jumping into the back of a garbage truck to recover swordfish, which police had confiscated because they're a protected species. Many protesters felt the machine was started on purpose and saw it as representative of deeper abuses of power in the country.
We came to condemn this odious crime against martyr Mohsin Fikri. We strongly condemn what we have seen with our own eyes.
Authorities have responded quickly, with the prosecutor's office concluding the death was an involuntary homicide and a criminal investigation's been launched. It's been 5 years since pro-democracy protests shook the country. Back then, promises of constitutional reform saved Morocco from a similar fate to many of its regional neighbours caught up in the Arab Spring uprisings. But the recent unrest in Morocco raised this question. Is what we're seeing take place right now an echo of the Arab Spring?
Superficially, it is reminiscent. The death of Mr. Fikri was a horrible, horrible death that galvanised a population and took on symbolic importance. But at the same time, I would be hesitant to overdraw links between 2011 and what we're seeing.
It seems like the protests that are taking place right now are quite concentrated in certain parts of the country. Is it something we're likely to see spread across the rest of the country?
No, I think it will continue to be focused in the Rif region, which is ethnically Berber and has long-standing grievances with the central government. That said, there have been protests in Casablanca and Marrakesh, which are unusual, as these tend to have a much higher security profile than the rest of the country.
How closely linked is what's happening right now with these protests over the death and the fact that you've got a new government in power?
I think there is a sense of impatience in Morocco at the pace of the reforms that were promised in 2011. And that will continue to cause issues until the government fully implements its promises. At the same time, the government has just been elected and does have a mandate to govern, and I think that will do a lot to reduce any future protest movements going forward.
The unrest has since calmed down, and the country's currently playing host to the international community for the COP22 climate summit. But the recent protests are warning to the new political leaders that reforms in the country are still needed, and soon. Sarah Firth reporting for Insight.
Let's talk about this further. I'm joined by Ahmad Mesdour, a political analyst at Africa Matters, an Africa-focused consultancy. Why are the authorities, the monarchy, the government, paying so little attention to these protests?
Well, I think they actually are paying a lot of attention to the protests because the timing of the crisis is actually not very useful inconvenient for the government, given that they are hosting the COP22 conference, and obviously the government and the monarchy want to present a united nation, a nation that is, an example of stability and modernity in the region. So actually, the timing of the crisis means that they have to pay even more attention. And I think another kind of contributing factor to the need to pay attention to the crisis is the fact that just a month ago, the country had important elections to select a new government, and talks are still ongoing to form that government. So therefore, a lot of the attention has to be drawn towards what is causing it and how to actually bring down the pressure, the popular demand for reform, for change on the streets.
During that election process, there was talk of reform, there was talk of implementing change. Is any of it going to get done, or will it all get lost in these negotiations of how to put a government together?
Well, I think that pressure will be put on the incoming government. The Prime Minister is in a kind of haggling situation at the moment, where he has to ensure that he meets the needs and requirements of as many parties as he can to join his coalition. But the King has made it very clear that underpinning those discussions must be the need for this reform, and these reforms that must address socio-economic and political demands. It can't just be a negotiation over the distribution of political posts, as if this was some kind of election booty, as he described it.
Right, and yet some of the critics, some of the King's critics, say that he is part of the problem of not actually driving for reforms. Would you say, from standing aside and outside the country, actually he is driving change through the country? He's aware of the need for change, if you like.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer, given the kind of complexity of the dynamics between the monarchy and the government.
Yeah.
They both have different prerogatives, and unlike the United Kingdom, for example, the monarchy in Morocco actually has a little bit more oversight. In fact, one could argue that it's the power
in day-to-day life and day-to-day decisions, isn't
Absolutely. You could actually argue that is the power behind the government actually pulling the strings. So a lot of the attention is drawn towards what the King is willing to make in terms of concessions. And certainly after the Arab Spring protests, a lot of people drew positive comments around the constitution, the reforms that were placed. Time will tell whether or not he is genuine around his commitment now to showing people that he has understood the message, that the monarchy has understood the message, but it will be the government's job to actually implement the policies. And until they actually form a coalition, until we know what the nature of that coalition looks like, it's very difficult to say.
And obviously, political haggling, as is the way of these things, when you're trying to put a coalition together, will have to play their part, won't they? But in a sense, is the King even more powerful? Could his demand, his wish, his intent that change come, and some of the people who feel so detached from the future of Morocco and the way their country is going to be run and so on, will at least, have their day and have some change, actually see real change in their lives?
The key to what is going to happen now will be the palace's implication in government policy, in driving government policy to address those concerns.
Yes.
Right now, what is at the heart of the protest is a sentiment we've seen throughout the Arab world during the Arab Spring. This rejection of a notion called hugra, which is injustice or oppression. There is a need for social justice, economic justice. People want jobs. People want to be treated fairly. Can the monarchy place that kind of pressure on government, or will it? It really.
There's the question.
It's really unclear for the time being.
I mean, no king can fix jobs, can they? I mean, a country's economy has to be allowed to grow. Good policies have to be adopted by any government. Is the king the pivotal person, though, to make sure that this, above and beyond any haggling as to who's going to do what job and how big your representation is in the new government, is he that powerful enough to insist, if you like, that this change comes?
Absolutely. He certainly has the power to call on the government to make the necessary reforms.
Right.
In fact, the palace even has the power to, in some ways, drive the means by which the reforms are conducted. But for the time being, the reforms that we've seen from 2011 up until now have not met the expectations of people who were already protesting in 2011.
Too little, too slowly. That's what they say, don't they?
Absolutely. And another key factor to consider moving forward is actually that we're seeing the protests actually dwindle now. We're seeing them in a more frequent manner. We're seeing less protesters. And when the pressure does come down, then you actually see less of an imperative perhaps from the political class, including the palace, or less pressure on them to deliver on that reform agenda. So it will depend also on whether or not these social movements that emerge every time there is these kinds of crises, whether or not they're able to maintain their activism and their review of government policy in a way which forces them to take action.
I mean, the cause could not be more dramatic, could it? This hideous video, too horrific to show on a general news programme, of this poor fisherman apparently being ground to death in a dump truck, with the implication it was done deliberately. That seems to be what the protesters in that part of the world are saying. I mean, from your perspective, do you think more explanation needs to be given by the authorities, or a better explanation of why what happened came to pass?
Well, for one, I think what happened, the reason why there was the reaction that there was on the streets is that it was so symbolic of the kind of pain that people are feeling day to day in their lives.
Yes.
That is a direct pain and also an indirect pain. The indirect pain is perhaps some of the issues I mentioned around socioeconomic challenges, unemployment, lack of housing, lack of access to equal opportunity. But the more direct one is the kind of blunt force that is sometimes used by government institutions, officials, in carrying out their functions day to day.
There could not be a more powerful metaphor, could it?
Absolutely.
To say a section of the population is quite literally rubbish, and we will just wash you away.
And it's so reminiscent of what happened. This, by the way, isn't the first incident in Morocco. We've had incidents where people have burnt themselves, set themselves alight. You've had Mohamed Bouazizi, if you'll remember, in Tunisia, who sparked, for some, in a symbolic way, the Arab Spring. He was, he was unhappy with his situation and burned himself. I think it speaks to the pain that people are feeling, and this is why. And I think one other dynamic that's worth mentioning, by the way, is that the regional dynamic here. This occurred in a region that is majoritarily Amazigh, the Rif region, which has traditionally had a very difficult and complex and tense relationship with the monarchy and the central government. And as a result, the tensions, I think, were already kind of boiling under the surface anyways, and that just added a further catalyst and compounded the tensions that I just mentioned.
Thank you very much indeed for being with us today. This is Insight. Coming up, how a new satellite could help save lives and give you a more accurate weather forecast.